Although it is now well known that the new Gilded Age in which we now live is characterized by the coexistence of concentrated oases of affluence sitting side by side with expansive deserts of mass poverty. Stratification in Africa is relatively underappreciated, compared to poverty, for example. We know from the International Social Science Council that since 1992, the volume of publications on inequality has increased fivefold. But most of these publications focus on the top 1% of households in the advanced capitalist countries, much like Thomas Piketty's blockbuster Capital in the 21st Century and more recent research published in leading journals such as Social Forces. So the trend of relative neglect continues, although inequality in Africa is widespread, is increasing, and has serious consequences for society, for economy, and for environment. Cities in Africa are growing both in physical and economic terms, but so is their inequality. According to UN Habitat reports, and I quote, African cities are the most unequal in the world, end of quote. Aside this spatial inequality, there is also much social inequality. We know from the essay written by Cyril Ramaphosa in London's Financial Times that intergroup inequality is on the rise. And we know from the work of Dorrit Postel, formerly Chair of Development Studies at KwaZulu-Natal University, that intra-group inequality is also on the rise. These inequalities are not just internal, they are also international and indeed intercontinental. Per capita monthly GDP in sub-Saharan Africa is 10 to 20 times less than what pertains in Western Europe, North America, and Japan. Yes, we can say that Africa is rising, or more precisely, that until recently, Africa was rising. But Africa's contribution to world GDP has remained stuck at a meager 2% since 2005. We know that 24 of the 26 poorest countries in the world are concentrated in Africa. So justifying a focus on stratification is quite straightforward, not just because of its relative neglect, not even just because of its serious consequences, but also because analytically focusing on stratification enables us to develop a more global picture of inequality. Why? Because the stratification analyst is forced to answer questions about unequal in relation to what, unequal in relation to whom, how, where, and why. But providing the justification for my talk today is the easiest of my tasks. It is more exacting to think through why inequality exists and persists. In fact, so difficult is this task that, with your permission, I'd like to illustrate it with the help of a parable, one that I got from Robert Gordon, the anthropologist of Africa. During a service at an old synagogue in eastern Ethiopia, when the Shema prayer was said, half the congregants sat and the other half stood. The trouble is that the half that stood started yelling at the half that sat, claiming that the tradition during Shema is in fact to stand and not to sit. The half that sat retorted that the tradition is rather to sit and not to stand. The officiating priestess, learned as she was in the practices and rituals of the synagogue, was confused. She was prevailed upon to consult a 100-year-old housebound elder who was one of the original founders of the synagogue. So, accompanied by the leaders of the two factions, they journeyed to the house of this elder. When they arrived, it was the leader of the faction that stood who went first. Is the tradition to stand during Shema? The elder said, no, that's not the tradition. At this point, the leader of the faction that sat was quite excited. She said, well, then is the tradition to sit during Shema? The elder said, no, that's not the tradition. At this point, the officiating minister, priestess, was even more puzzled. So she approached the elder and said, well, but these congregants, they fight all the time, yelling at each other that the tradition is this or it is that. The elder interrupted, exclaiming, that is the tradition. The tradition is to yell at each other and to quarrel about traditions. In African development studies, the tradition is to constantly quarrel about the causes of stratification. In development economics, the tendency or the tradition is to claim that stratification is the product of scarcity of human capital, scarcity of physical capital, natural capital problems, and what they call the culture of poverty. Ever since Jan Tinbergen, the great Dutch economist, taught the economists that inequality is really the result of a rat race between education, which supplies skilled labor, and technological transformation, which determines how much of that skilled labor is demanded. We learn from the authoritative account of Sir Tony Atkinson that the economists have not made any deviation from this beaten track. Theoretically, the culture of poverty idea can be traced to the work of the anthropologist Oscar Lewis. But in practice, this idea can be explained in two ways. The more conservative is to claim that the Africans have been born with certain cultures that keep them behind. But the more, well, liberal, or if you like, progressive, is to say that, well, the Africans indeed have cultures that keep them behind. But they were not born with these cultures. Rather, it is poverty itself that created these cultures, or that it is colonialism that created these cultures. So it is a case of pleading guilty, but with explanation. In this sense, poverty is either the result of nature or nurture, but it is always a function of culture. The natural capital problem has become a widely discussed issue in the study of Africa. It has got a long and complicated history, but in development studies at least, it is traced to the work of Richard Orty, especially what he put forward in his book, The Resource Curse Thesis. It's probably now unclear who provided the initial theoretical inspiration for the idea that it is the lack of accumulation of capital which keeps Africa behind. But what is crystal clear is that the chief advocates of the idea that more and more and more physical accumulation would address the problem of stratification have all been decorated with the Nobel Prize in Economic Science. I have here in mind Robert Solow, Robert Lucas Jr., and now Paul Roma. Going by the analysis in the book, The Nobel Factor, this fact probably says more about the power groups in economics, what they prefer, and how that preference supports certain capitalist and Western interest, than anything that reflects the inner aspirations of what Frantz Fanon once called the wretched of the earth. But from that perspective too, from the perspective of the masses too, there has been much theorizing about the causes of stratification. Many of the writers in this progressive tradition, as this tradition is often called, are Africans. Examples of some of the leading names are Amenamama, Rita Kiki Idochi, and Georgie Chikata. Walter Rodney, Issa Shivji, Tandika Mkamdawari, and Samir Amin, as well as other Africanists such as Fred Cooper, Emmanuel Wallerstein, Deborah Pello, Sarah Berry, and from the Nordic part, Carola Lenz. From Germany, Carola Lenz. These critics have made important contributions to our understanding of stratification in Africa. Their contributions range from extending the work in Marxist political economy through dependency or world systems theories, neoliberalism, globalization, post-colonial critiques, and to historical institutionalism. Whether their critiques or their work can be said to have created what Thomas Kuhn once called scientific revolutions is moot. Going by the work of Polly Hill, that famous economic anthropologist, and Martin Jevin, the economic historian, we can say that this body of work is fraught with major problems. The tradition has been to claim that these problems arise either from economics as a field or from the practices of economists as the practitioners in the field, not to both. So, in a recent paper published in the Journal of Economic Methodology, the famous Finnish political economist Uskalimäki argues that, in fact, we should be blaming economists, not economics, for these problems. But for the controversial Australian political economist Steve Keen, it is, to quote him, the madness in their method. End of quote. What makes Hill's and Martin's critiques interesting is that they say that the truth lies somewhere in the middle, that it is a hybridized or braided link between economics and economists that can tell us more about the problems in this field. Polly Hill's principal challenge to development economics is both conceptual and pragmatic. She sought, and I quote, to expose what I see as the old-fashioned, stereotyped, Western biased, overgeneralized crudity and conceptual falsity of so many conventional economic premises, as well as economists' complacent attitude to bad official statistics. End of quote. Hill took aim at the unit of analysis in both neoclassical development economics and Marxist development economics. For the neoclassicists, Hill took aim at the economics of the households, for which the following are key central assumptions. One, that households in Africa are homogeneous. Two, that these households are headed by the African man, who, surprise, surprise, is also an economic man. Three, that the activities of wives and of women more generally can be inferred from the activities of the African man. Hence, that there is much information flow or perfect information about and within these households. These assumptions are necessary to sustain the claim that there is, in fact, perfect competition. According to Hill, in practice, there's much heterogeneity about households in Africa. According to Hill, there's much information asymmetry. According to Hill, the African man is not necessarily an economic man, a point that I'd like to anecdotally affirm as an African man myself. Hill argues that true, the economic strategy or strategies of African women can sometimes be dependent, but they are also they are often independent and many times only interdependent. Hill argues that in Marxist political economy, there are similar conceptual problems. She takes as an example the idea of peasant. If the peasant is supposed to be, or if peasants are supposed to be stragglers, then according to Hill, in practice, there aren't really any peasants, because the people that are often regarded as peasants, including the West African cocoa farmer, earn incomes not just from agrarian sources, but they also earn income in other industries, and they are not really stragglers. If peasants are supposed to be people who share some kind of revolutionary vision and have this idea of a shared enemy, then in practice, according to Hill, there aren't really any peasants, because these people are so different that they don't have this idea of a shared enemy. Whether neoclassical economics or neoclassical development economics or Marxist development economics, Hill argues that the issue of wealth transmission between groups and within groups is very poorly treated in the field. Hill suggests that the way to address these problems is simply to seek a marriage between economics and anthropology in what she calls indigenous African economics. Polly Hill deserves the attention that I have given her. Her book, Development Economics on Trial, is a major book, and it remains a classic. But there are major problems with Polly Hill's work as well. She neglects questions of rent, questions of space, and questions of energy, suggesting that the mainstream treats these questions quite sufficiently. In fact, the mainstream treats these questions problematically, and hence, by treating these issues lightly, Polly Hill overlooks or neglects major conveyor belts for the creation of stratification in Africa. So I caution against Hill's preference for an indigenous economics. Similar problems characterize Morton Jervin's work. Jervin, whose book, Africa, Why Economists Get It Wrong, catapulted him to the status of a celebrity, argues that economists get Africa wrong because they manipulate their data, that the data that they use are often cooked, that the data on which they rely are usually unreliable because they are so dated. Nowhere are these problems as compounded as in the estimation of GDP figures on which much economics is based today. For Morton Jervin, the solution is simply to collect better statistics and do better history. Despite its excellent analysis, Jervin's book neglects what Paul Baran once called, and I quote, the political economy of growth. The book gives little attention to whether social progress is in fact accurately measured by GDP, in what ways the emphasis on GDP actually leads to the devaluation of informal labor, and the direct link between GDP addiction and the brazen destruction of the environment in Africa. Even more seriously, the book overlooks the invention of GDP as a definite statement of political power by the West. GDP as a springboard for the West to project its power in Africa and elsewhere in the global South. It is this hegemony of this political number, what the Italian political economist Lorenzo Fioramonti calls gross domestic problem, that must be questioned. And in fact, it is this hegemony that should lead us to jolt the GDP, not just the technical and technocratic aspects of the GDP. In short, both Polly Hill and Martin Jervin provide idealist critiques. They ignore the various interests that continue to support the status quo. They ignore the history of development economics, a history that's supposed to make certain interests in the West, certain capitalist interests feel good about themselves. A point that has been systematically developed in the book, The Nature of Mass Poverty, written by the Harvard University political economist J.K. Galbraith. Analytically, this idealism in the work of Polly Hill and Martin Jervin is a problem because, as Michel Devroy once noted, and I quote, "In a class society, the ruling class cannot be indifferent to the type of social science developing in the society in which it holds power." End of quote. We need alternatives. However, if the tradition is not to sit, then the tradition is not necessarily to stand. In my humble view, the reconstruction we need cannot simply be about adopting existing alternatives, because these existing alternatives are indeed fraught with major problems. To give one example, let's take this explanatory frame that can best be called Africanus homo culturalis. This idea that it is the culture of Africans that keep them impoverished or that keep them behind. This idea is not just in neoclassical development economics. It's not restricted to Marxist political economy. It is quite common in development studies and comes in various shades and forms. That maybe some Africans are corrupted, that's why they remain behind, or because Africans are normally late for work, or they don't work hard enough, or this kind of thing. It's quite common. The point I make here, I make quite briefly, but this particular point, this weakness about Africanus homo culturalis has been systematically and more carefully studied, and the result presented in the book Economics, Culture, and Development, written by the highly influential and impressive Sudanese feminist political economist Ayman Zain Ilabdin. A most revealing book. The insights in this book make the hymn, "Amazing Grace, I once was blind, but now I can see," more and more meaningful. A second example is the question of space. Since 1980, when the Nigerian spatial theorist Akin Mabugunje first forcefully put the case for development scholars to embrace what he called a spatial perspective in theorizing about the development process, much spatial theorizing has taken place. Indeed, by 1984, when Charles Gore was writing his book, Regions in Question, it has become quite popular for development thinkers to theorize or say something about space. The trouble is that the theorizing was done or was taking place in the wrong way. Cities, for example, were thought of in themselves, not as part of the wider development process. This is the problem that Charles Gore called spatial separatism. Spatial separatism remains a big problem in development theorizing. As Charles Gore's 2017 paper for the Cambridge Journal of Regions, Economy and Society shows, perhaps it could even be said that spatial separatism has become even more serious with the rise of geographical economics, or what they call new economic geography. However, the problem won't be solved by business as usual or by simply stretching the pet explanatory framework in the alternative school, what J.K. Gibson Graham called capitalocentrism in their feminist critique of political economy. We need to move past the old order. We need to move towards a new beginning. But in doing so, it is important to continuously stress that the tradition of recurrently debating the causes of stratification in Africa has simply generated, to put it euphemistically, more heat than light, to use a phrase that Philip Mirowski once used in a different context. It is this limitation that Ayikwe Ama, the Ghanaian writer, once captured in his novel, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. The real problem of the existing knowledge about stratification in Africa is not that it fails in its exposition. It is rather that it succeeds in obfuscating reality. It conveniently overlooks what R.T. Ely once called the ground under our feet. It strenuously claims that we now live in an era in which it is pointless to consider questions of land and rent. It strenuously claims that even if, well, we can consider questions of land and rent, it is too narrow. In other words, this tradition obfuscates the crime of stratification. Like other crimes, deflecting attention from itself is one of the features of this crime of stratification. The appeal to culture is simply to mask shocking forms of rantierism. The view that Africa is rising is simply to legitimize the status quo. And the stubborn insistence that it is only capital that matters serves as a convenient stratagem by both the left and the right, progressive and mainstream writers, to hide their own complicity as beneficiaries of the historical and ongoing system of land, property, and rent extraction. In such circumstances, it is simply wrong to ask for a change. What we need is not just change. What we need is a just change. I propose stratification economics as one path towards that change. Stratification economics has been pioneered by black economists and other economists of color. This subfield is characterized by at least three features. One, a focus on stratification as the central problem. Two, a rejection of existing mainstream, progressive, left-right interpretations of stratification. And three, a genuine commitment to investigating the sources and reasons for the persistence of stratification. In other words, it's committed to finding new explanations of stratification in Africa. This subfield of economics is considered to be sufficiently new by the Journal of Economic Literature, which now recognizes not just economic sociology, not just economic anthropology, but also social and economic stratification. Property, institutions, and social stratification in Africa. My book, which would be published later this year in the Cambridge Stratification Economics series, is a modest contribution to this subfield. While monopoly capital and monopoly profit continue to be the points of departure for much attempts at reconstructing existing ideas about stratification, my book takes as its starting point the question of monopoly land and monopoly rent. Indeed, all other forms of rent more and more seriously. In turn, I also have a special cross-cutting spatial interest in explaining stratification, for example, in terms of technology, international trade, and debt. To my mind, the most advanced social science tradition that can handle these sort of questions is the Georgist tradition. Its method of analysis first developed in full in 1898 in the book The Science of Political Economy by Henry George himself, is simply the systematic reconstruction of political economy currently largely centered on capital and profits to recentering it on land and rent in their relationship with capital and labor, and indeed other forms of identity. Modern Georgist theorists are quite narrow. They're quite ahistorical, quite nationalistic, quite sectoral, and very neglectful of stratification in Africa. To address these problems, my method is to seek a hybridized blend of analytical Georgism with stratification economics by drawing on the original manuscripts of Henry George himself and on the ideas of black economists and philosophers such as William Darity of Duke University and Sir Hilary Beckles of the University of West Indies. I come, then, to sharpen stratification economics, not to praise it. I come to build on Georgist political economy, not to bury it. I come to engage, not to dismiss what others have done. This integrative method is a better choice, I suggest, than the alternative fragmentary approach, which rests on a very troubling logic. A logic which is likened by Morton Jervin to the man who bragged to his friends that he could survive throwing himself down from the 100th floor of a building complex in Manhattan. Every time he whizzed past a floor, he would shout to his friends, "So far, so good," forgetting that it's not the floor-by-floor journey that mattered. Well, that matters, but it is that journey together with the total impact on the ground floor that really matters. A lesson that he learned rather too late. This solemn end is one that my integrative approach helps me to avoid. Instead, I am directed to fruitful avenues of data, including primary data that I have collected myself, a reinterpretation of existing data collected by others or produced by the courts, and the weaving together of fragmentary data, or the systematization of fragmentary existing data. Of course, Africa is wide, diverse, and very complex, but I have greatly benefited from being the substantive editor of the African Review of Economics and Finance and working with bright Africans in the last 10 years, during which the journal has existed and has tried to publish good research on Africa. I give key concepts such as land, rent, and space particular meanings that are more akin to Georgist Africanist stratification conceptions, rather than problematic meanings utilized in neoclassical development economics, geographical economics, and new institutional economics. It is on the basis of this approach that the book argues that instead of regenerative and inclusive development, the existing system transfers rents from producers and reproducers to absentee landlords, a process whose intensification, although widely recommended, is only likely to accentuate existing stratification, including capitalist contradictions, impede attempts to addressing these problems, and simply hide supporting structural processes in plain sight. If this argument sounds ordinary, it is because it is ordinary. Nevertheless, systematically demonstrating this argument is important, among others, because it has serious implications. I suggest that if the argument is upheld, the polarizing debate between Vivek Chiba and some of the proponents of Southern theory could be resolved. For the argument tries to redefine matters of priority and explanation. Indeed, if the argument is upheld, it should follow that Africa's development cannot simply be understood as a case of changing gears from one goal to another. It cannot even be understood as simply changing development ideas from one paradigm to another, because even though paradigms are bigger than goals, they are still idealist. Rather, like Walter Rodney's conception of development, this argument implies that development must be seen as a reorganization of how production, distribution, and their rewards are shared both internally and internationally. But unlike Rodney, that reorganization can look down at what, as I said, R.T. Ely calls the ground under our feet. The trouble with my approach is that in trying to put together so many lines of analysis that are traditionally considered to be incommensurable, it can easily descend into madness. But if it does not descend into madness, and rather if it succeeds, then it can also sanitize much madness about how Africa continues to be behind. In circumstances like this, when the perils of madness and the possibilities of sanity stand side by side, we need, to quote Thomas Sankara, that great Burkinabe leader and thinker, to have the courage to turn our backs on old formulas and the courage to invent the future. Thank you very much.